It is no secret that poor governance in Africa hampers progress. This Future Cities Africa episode is with Dr. Ross Harvey, Director of Research and Programs at Good Governance Africa. We discuss major governance challenges Africa is facing, potential solutions, how change can happen, emerging disruptors, and if there is a glimmer of hope. Ross, welcome. It's great to have you on the show. Can you give us an overview of your background and your role at Good Governance Africa?
Thanks, Dan. I studied economics for my sins after having spent 2 years in the UK, just trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I think the more time I spent there, the more I realized that really it wasn't okay for South Africa in particular, but the whole of our continent to just continue to fester in misery. And so I really wanted to be part of the solution. So I came back, I suppose, somewhat naively to UCT and studied economics, philosophy, and politics, and then ended up doing a PhD in economics, which I eventually completed at the end of 2019. And the subject of my thesis was to try and understand the institutional evolution of Nigeria and Angola and the way in which oil affects the political and economic landscape and a country's political institutions. And it turns out that oil is not always the initial problem, but often the exacerbating problem when it does enter the equation, especially if good governance mechanisms are not in place at the time of discovering commercial quantities of oil. So that, I suppose, in a sense, led me down this somewhat inevitable path. I got a call from the founder of Good Governance Africa, and on the subject of how do we address this resource curse. Africa is full of natural resources. We really should be highly developed by now, but it seems to be an affliction rather than a blessing. I ended up joining Good Governance Africa in May 2020, right in the middle of lockdown, and also for the last 2 years and a bit have been engaged in really trying to build up our profile, ensure our credibility, work with others to really try and amplify our potential impact. Having a real impact in the policy space is actually quite tricky, uh, and so we're not always great at being able to attribute impact to ourselves. But certainly, I think that in the last 2 years and a bit, myself and Chris Maroleng, who came in as our executive director, have we've enjoyed the benefit of being able to work with colleagues who are fully committed to seeing Africa transformed, and we believe that it can happen. So we're fighting the good fight of faith here and hoping for transformation in governance terms across the continent.
Who and what exactly is Good Governance Africa? What is your strategic objectives? What do you hope to achieve?
So we operate under a new model called Inspire, which really sets out kind of 7 pillars that define who we are as an organization. But in a nutshell, we exist to improve citizens' lives through improved governance performance. It's our belief that the basic building blocks of any society are transparency and accountability. We want our institutions to be shaped by those values. And then more positively, we want institutions to be formed in such a way that, on the basis of good governance, investment is attracted that enables private sector dynamism. We really do believe that the primary solution to myriad challenges facing the continent, which I'll get into as we go on, is to create employment opportunity. And the more we enable that, the better for everyone. Of course, we want to attract responsible players in order to avoid the resource curse, which we were just talking about. And so at GGA, we're also a hybrid think tank. We're very firm on our why. We exist to improve citizens' lives. But we also don't want to be kind of purely donor dependent. We do believe there's value in being able to kind of put your money where your mouth is, as it were, and sell research consultancy services, and also sell some of our written products like Africa in Fact, if not on a subscription basis, then on advertising revenue basis. And again, it's part of the mandate of establishing relationships with the private sector. But yeah, Dan, in a nutshell, what we're trying to achieve is to improve government effectiveness and empower citizens to hold their states to account. And as those two relatively independent arms of governance work together, we want to see the creation of what Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson called a narrow corridor in their excellent 2019 book on, this question of how states form and how they become successful and how they create broad-based development. And it seems patently clear from the research that you need these two arms of governance to work together to create the sustained economic dynamism that can generate the kind of jobs that we need to address the challenges that we have on the continent. So that's really what we're trying to do. So we try to make our information accessible both to policymakers and to citizens, and in that process, inviting the private sector in to become development partners, to help both, to build good relationships with the communities in the areas in which they operate, but also to really help build institutional capacity where it's lacking. And it's our firm belief that companies would generally do better by partnering than by simply seeing themselves as resource extractors or policy takers. So we're trying to operate in that space then of inviting the private sector in to become part of this threefold solution: private sector dynamism, government effectiveness, which entails a whole lot of things. We want governments to be accountable. We want them to deliver services properly. We want them to put basic principles of good governance in place. And at the same time, we want citizens to really hold effective states to account. You don't want to be in a position like China where there's no real power sharing, the political landscape is not competitive, and that competition is basically good, at every level.
So, Ross, are you struggling to get the private sector part of this conversation?
We thankfully have found the private sector quite amenable to what we are trying to accomplish, and I think increasingly they see the value, and partly maybe it's some of the language that we use. Companies are familiar with kind of risk analysis and so on, but I think perhaps sometimes are willing to overlook real risks or not dig into risks as proficiently as they might, and they make mistakes. You see very large multinationals making mistakes in places like Mozambique and Guinea, and seeing asset write-downs. And what we're really saying is, look, we can help. We don't have all the answers, but things that you might see as a cost initially, we want to encourage you to see as an investment in long-term returns. And sure, it may come at the cost of next quarter's shareholder returns, but you might still be in the game 20 years from now when others have abandoned. So we are finding the private sector more and more amenable. Obviously, it takes time to develop a reputation. We're not just another EY or Deloitte or private consultancy firm.
So there are many challenges, but what are the major challenges that Africa is currently facing, and how is Good Governance Africa positioned to help in addressing these issues?
I think what we are clear on is the challenges that we are trying to address. And I think it's helpful to start by saying that we really do see climate change as perhaps the dominant challenge, cross-cutting challenge that will be afflicting the continent for decades to come. And I think it's easy to be despondent about some of the climate change work. both because of the fact that we've overstepped all these planetary boundaries, and it's really difficult to reverse that. At the same time, there's a collective action problem, right? What we've seen with the war in Ukraine is it's all good and well to have net zero ambitions, but if that leaves people freezing at home because they can't access Russian oil, then you're going to start up your coal-fired power stations again. So there are these kind of challenges. So we are also aware, of course, that Africa has been, on the whole, a very minor contributor to climate change problems, but we have to be part of the adaptation solution because we only have one planet. So of course there's hypocrisy and so on, but we do need to, I think, really think about how we're going to get involved in adapting to climate change and doing whatever we can to mitigate it as well, even though we weren't initially part of the problem. The data suggests that we contribute 4% of global emissions, but we are going to suffer the brunt of the problem. So on that note, at the SADC office, we set up a human security and climate change program, which deals specifically with the challenges of climate change, the direct impacts, but then also the indirect impacts. We know that climate change is increasingly going to be a driver of migration. That migration in turn can cause conflict, in addition to the conflict that exists kind of inherently over increasingly scarce resources. Plus, there are sometimes infrastructural decisions that are made that don't help. I could be one example. We have the Stigler's Gorge Dam being built in Tanzania. And we would say, look, that's a poor idea. In a climate change context where you already have two dams upstream and increasingly less frequent rainfall, this is not the best way in which to generate power, especially given its downstream agricultural and ecological effects. And as the cost of new technologies goes down and microgrids become more feasible and so on, regarding solar, wind, what have you, that would probably be a better way to go. So often you're up against kind of political mega infrastructure projects that carry legacy opportunity for leaders and so on. So we're trying to again just communicate solutions in a way that can really land well. So that hence human security and climate change. And then related to that, of course, is natural resource governance. We do think that the resource curse is a major challenge. It shouldn't be that resource wealthy countries remain so underdeveloped. And all the new research coming out is it kind of permanently corroborates the thesis, unfortunately. And again, the solution, to put it somewhat simplistically, is to form governance institutions that can actually manage resource wealth properly. And so part of what we do in the natural resource governance program is not just to try and ensure transparency and accountability in how the sector is governed, but then also connect mineral wealth to industrialization opportunities where possible in the value chain. And we want those opportunities to not be ecologically destructive. So we are trying to truncate that curve. We don't want Africa to become wealthy through the typical process of degradation. We'd really love to see industrialization that absorbs labor being ecologically friendly. We think that is possible. It just requires a lot of foresight and planning. And then having said all of this, it's great to have good ideas around how to deal with climate change-driven migration and how to reverse the resource curse. But at a very basic governance level, if countries are not experiencing free and fair elections and citizens are apathetic or coerced or manipulated or afraid of being involved in politics in any kind of meaningful way, then it's very difficult actually to sell the argument of policy that serves everyone. Elites typically make calculations of repression versus reform, and in many African contexts, unfortunately, elites see it as less costly to repress than to reform. Um, and so we're big on trying to ensure free and fair elections and greater political involvement. An associated challenge, across the board, Dan, obviously is something that Danny Roddick called premature deindustrialization, where we find that African and Latin American countries, but especially African countries, are moving out of manufacturing at lower median per capita income levels and sooner than their industrialized counterparts. Because manufacturing typically absorbs labor, we've kind of bypassed that stage, and that actually has to be reversed. So hence, part of the reason why I emphasize the importance of us tapping into mineral value chains, especially regarding, the ambition for net zero and transport and energy revolutions. We have to tap into those value chains, but specifically with a view to absorbing labor, because growing youth unemployment is simply going to exacerbate already poverty that at the moment our poverty levels are threatening to regress to 1990 levels unless we start planning very astutely. So our challenges are manifold, and we've structured our research departments in such a way as to be, to take an integrated approach, but to treat these problems kind of in their lanes.
So, on the Kenya elections earlier this year, do you see that as positive or negative with regards to governance structures?
The Kenyan elections, as with the Zambian elections, have been very positive as far as we're concerned, and even the Angolan elections. But to your point around Kenya, I think there are two very encouraging things for me at a broad level. One is that dynasty you speak of, the post-colonial uh, tight-knit set of elites that have governed Kenya largely for their own benefit over the last 60 years. That has been brought to an end, and the fact that the courts upheld that decision is really positive. So I think you are starting to see the fruit, as it were, of democracy taking root. You know, I think in a lot of contexts we have democracy in name, but if you define democracy a little more strictly, where you say the opposition has a genuine chance of winning an election, that starts to narrow the playing field a bit. And I think that both in Kenya and Zambia, contrary to popular expectation, the opposition won, and it's a really positive thing. In and of itself, it doesn't kind of get at this problem of massive and growing youth unemployment, but hopefully it indicates a level of youth participation in the political process that bodes well. Voter apathy often is a function of the youth just saying, well, I see no future and I see no reason why I should participate. And sometimes they favor protest over voting because votes are rigged and so on. But even in a context where the incumbent had all the advantages of utilizing state apparatus and so on in Zambia and Kenya, the opposition still won.
What exactly is holding back or blocking good governance in Africa? What needs to change? What steps do we need to take?
We must recognize that inherited colonial institutional structures do play a part still, and even prior to colonialization, the impacts of slavery, for instance, are still with us. Both the arid slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade. There's a lot of very good economics work to show the long run negative development impacts of those legacy issues. So we shouldn't discount that. Having said that, there are solutions, and the current blockages, I think, are partly a function of lack of competence and confidence on the one hand, sometimes, and then also just a lack of incentive and a lack of accountability on the other hand. If it is, as I've kind of indicated before, that often elites calculate that it's less costly to repress citizens than it is to engage in genuine reform, then the question is, well, how do you shift the incentives? How do you shift the cost structure in such a way as that reform becomes very attractive? And I think that's part of what we're trying to do, is to say, look, it may be that you manage to grow the economy in a broad-based, labor-absorbing kind of way and retain power precisely because you delivered services, didn't abuse your position, were able to utilize the wealth, especially natural resource wealth, in a way that serves citizens. Now, it can sound like a somewhat naive hope, but the cases of Kenya and Zambia and Angola, just to name those in our region, are starting to communicate that actually it may be better to think slightly more long term than to try and extract as much as you possibly can within this narrow political cycle that, access to power that you think you have. And longevity of office may be a function of serving your citizens well rather than how it has been in the past, where you could just steal as much as you possibly can with no repercussions. There are repercussions at the voting station now. So again, to my mind, one of the massive obstacles to unblock here are the obstacles to free and fair elections. We know how governments rig elections. And I think increasingly we need to put very specific pressure on governments to kind of force them to abandon rigging techniques. You can't have ghost voters on the roll. You can't intimidate people ahead of elections. And actually, if you want to be part of the African Free Trade Agreement, or you want to continue membership in your regional economic bloc, then these are the conditions. And if you don't host free and fair elections according to these specific conditions, then we don't recognize you. And I think, African leaders probably need to get a bit stronger on that. We, along with a host of others, are trying to create that kind of pressure. But I think that's one massive obstacle to unblock. And I think that should open up the space for a whole lot of other obstacles to be unblocked. Infrastructure challenges can be addressed if there's more accountability around how money is spent. Better planning can occur if there's political accountability in local government. And competence starts to flow in as a function of investment. So we know that Africa can't grow without investment. Responsible investment isn't likely to be forthcoming until there's some indication of good governance starting to take root. But once that investment flows in, then the skills that come with it start to really build an economy. And you start to crowd out the irresponsible players. You start to change the norms. And so unproductive rent seeking starts to be suppressed or crowded out, as economists like to say. And I think that's what we really want to see. I could get into lots of specifics, but I think we have to start broad, and then we also have to start at the local level. One of the projects we have is to try and identify local municipalities that have performed really poorly in resource-rich areas in South Africa. And if we can get just basic King 4 principles of corporate governance established within those municipalities and have them adhering to the Municipal Finance Management Act and delivering services in adherence to their constitutional mandate, that would make a big difference. I think you need this kind of dual approach of let's get it right at a macro level, make sure that the political landscape is such that it attracts and invites competition. And then let's also get service delivery right at the local level. These two arms kind of have to work together.
Ross, what emerging disruptors do you foresee over the next decade?
I think often when people talk of disruptors, they tend to have kind of technological ones in mind. And I think there will be technological disruptors. Obviously, partly because I have a training in economics, economists are kind of wedded to having some kind of inherent faith in technology as a silver bullet, to solve all kinds of problems. And I think the truth is that technology can be used for good and evil. So we have to kind of keep an eye on technological disruptors. There are really promising technological interventions that can help us. Just things like wind and solar power, and the sheer pace at which those prices are dropping is extremely encouraging. Because if you can devolve power to the local level and manage distribution and generation and distribution at a localized level, then you forego having to build massive centralized transmission grids and so on. So I think there are very positive technological disruptors that are on the horizon. They create opportunities for us as well. As a continent, we are rich in the critical minerals required for driving energy and transport revolutions. But that's not a panacea, because mining lithium is a very dirty exercise. And so we are going to have proper environmental governance in place if we're going to tap into these opportunities, lithium, cobalt, copper, just to name a few. And again, political stability is a key kind of underlying factor to ensure that we harness these disruptive potentials adequately. One of the other major kind of disruptors on the horizon is something we touched on earlier, and that was your stat around the median youth proportion of most African populations. The proportion under age 25, I think Uganda has the youngest population. But if you look at the proportion of 15 to 64-year-olds across each continent by 2100, Africa will have by 2100 the largest contingent as a proportion of the population of 15 to 64-year-olds. Now, that's a potential blessing, or demographic dividend, as people like to call it. And African population will be at around 4 billion by 2100, which will mean that we will be over a third of the world's entire population, about 4 out of 11 billion. So you have to check my maths there. But that carries huge potential disruptive effects, especially in terms of migration. If Africa doesn't fast become well governed, then I think, given the climate change impacts I was speaking about earlier, we're going to see migration as a huge disruptor, not only to the continent, intercontinentally, but across continents. So technology and population growth, two big disruptors in the future. And then a positive disruptor, I think, is increasingly, it looks as if there's a glimmer of hope in terms of democratic maturity, where incumbent parties are willing to let go of power. And that happened in Malawi, it happened in Kenya, it happened in Zambia. I'm pretty sure that, all else being equal, and my standard economist qualifier, it'll happen in Angola as well, and it'll probably happen in South Africa in 2024. Probably urban migration, that is going to be a serious, and is already a massive disruptor. If I just think about in-migration into Cape Town and the kind of impact it has on the city's ability to deliver services, it's really significant. In a context of general and kind of average poor governance, if you do govern well, you can lay a rod for your own back, because you put pressure on your services. It's great to be able to offer health and education services for free to people who are from north of our borders, but it does create conflict over resources, and it does stretch the capacity of those involved in delivering those services. And I've seen this, unfortunately, firsthand. But the point is, we need all cities to function really, really well if we're going to deal with this migratory trend that's already happening and causing a bit of difficulty.
There is great doubt in the ability of the African and global governance order to respond to the challenges of our times. Is there a glimmer of hope?
Hope is such an evasive and enigmatic thing, because you want to be clear-eyed about the challenges, but you also don't want those challenges to be despondency-inducing. And I think often we ask ourselves difficult existential questions. Can we, as a small NGO in a sea of misgovernance, kind of really move the needle? And we think we can. I think what we kind of often have to recognize is that it takes longer than we initially expected, but it also takes time to learn what's effective and what isn't, and then to hone your approach accordingly. And the more we network and the more we engage with one another, different organizations, the more we start to understand and distill where we can add value. And I think it's in those spaces where you know that you're adding some value and potentially shifting the needle that does give some hope. And I think for a lot of us, identifying specific projects that could have an amplified effect and be that are replicable. In other words, that you can transpose in a context specific way into other arenas. If our kind of improvement of local governance performance, for instance, if that project was successful and we could replicate it not only in other parts of South Africa but also in the region, we think that would be fantastic. So that kind of, it's a challenge that keeps us up at night. It's also the source of hope. So I think we just live in this tension. Some of the challenges can really seem monumental, especially when commitments regarding climate finance, for instance, are not entirely forthcoming. That can be despondency inducing, but one understands as well, that you can't only depend on external sources of financing. We do actually have to find homegrown solutions, for lack of a better phrase. And there are opportunities available, but we have to pick our partners correctly and we've got to stay engaged. I think people working in our kind of space across the continent maybe are often tempted to think, if I went to New Zealand or Canada or something, they would all be hunky-dory, but they have their own challenges, and the grass is not always greener on the other side. Just think about the challenges faced by the UK at the moment, unaffordable energy bills, and that they're going to have to make some very difficult decisions about how to address that. And if you look at their political discourse, there isn't a lot of engagement on how to deal with these very intractable and difficult problems of increases in the cost of living, how to respond to external shocks like the Russia-Ukraine war, the supply chain disruptions that continue to happen because of COVID. It raises difficult questions. But there are so many glimmers of hope, actually, and so many committed people, actually. This is very encouraging. I was just reading an article about a framework put together by some guys at Harvard for just a framework of how to establish a new global order that doesn't lead to big power rivalry, that we're starting to see really play out now. And talk this morning even of Russia's just pig-headedness and wanting to continue their domination of Ukraine can be concerning. But there are frameworks available for incentivizing cooperation rather than competition. Not everyone has to agree ideologically or policy-wise or anything, but if you set up channels for communication and ensuring cooperation despite difference, again, it can sound very naive to the to those who've cut their teeth in this space, but I think just the fact that we have dedicated people thinking about these kind of things is really encouraging. We've just got to stay the distance.
Ross, in closing, what is your vision for the future of cities? What would you like to see?
Dan, so how we get there, I'm not entirely sure, but I worked for the city of Cape Town for a year, quite a long time ago now, 2007, so 15 years ago. And even back then, my vision for cities is probably largely ecologically driven. I would love to see cities making more use, more optimal use of their natural resources. You think about a city like Cape Town, I'd love to see the city harnessing more of its stormwater and returning what used to be open rivers back to open rivers. I know this entails kind of digging up streets and what have you, which would create even more traffic drama. Ideally, politics and some immediate obstacles aside, I would love to see cities restoring their natural waterways. I'd like to see some of that water being harvested to reduce some of the climate change impacts that we feel. More localized sources of water instead of relying on big dams that easily silt up and have high evaporation rates like Teobardos. And I'd love to see cities being largely self-sustaining. I'd like to see more hydroponics, more vertical agriculture. I'd like to see bylaws being enacted that pretty much strongly incentivize homes to get off the grid insofar as is possible, water and energy wise, just to free up resources to serve the poor better. That's always a bit of a politically unpalatable thing to say. We subsidize wealthy homes to get off the grid, and then free up resources. And the question that comes back always is, well, where are we going to get money to do that? If we don't sell electricity at a surcharge to consumers. But I think what you're seeing with load shedding is people are getting off the grid anyway, and so cities, the revenue that they've traditionally relied on is going to be diminished. So I think cities are really going to have to try and attract investment kind of off their own backs, and then become part of the solution to infrastructural and other governance challenges. Again, think about Cape Town. The city needs to become part of the solution to problems that they typically ascribe to, oh, well, it's national government jurisdiction. We can't, our hands are tied. Sure, I know that their hands often are tied, but if they could get the rail infrastructure right, even rent it from Transnet and have a functional rail system, that would alleviate a lot of the traffic pressure and would probably allow for some of the rivers to be restored and for us to use boats in the city centre rather than cars, or to build flyovers. And I'd like to see some of our cities redesigned, largely in an incremental way, but there's got to be a vision for how to do cities better and to plan for that in-migration that we were talking about earlier, because that's coming as we see drought and flood and fire frequency increase across the continent. We are going to see quite a lot of migration, both into primary and secondary cities, as you rightly mentioned. And I think we've got to be prepared for that. Again, it's why it's important for cities that are doing relatively well to try and impart their knowledge insofar as is possible to others that are doing less well, so that the buffer, that shock absorber, I like to think of that little device that we used to put on our tennis rackets. If you didn't hit the ball in the sweet spot, you had that little shock absorber to help you. We need that across the continent. We need cities from Cairo to Cape Town actually being able to absorb shocks that are coming. These shocks are not unforeseeable. They are reasonably foreseeable, and therefore you can plan for them. So Dan, that's my vision for the future of cities is ecologically driven, places in which people really want to live, food secure, kind of in their own right, and attracting investment that kind of really aids the vision. How do we get there? Governance.
A big thank you to Dr. Ross Harvey for this insightful conversation on how to achieve good governance in Africa.